Nobody looks twice at the girl in the red uniform. That's the point. Cherry moved through the Vantablack Hotel like breath, present, necessary, and completely invisible to the people she served. Her footsteps never made a sound on the marble floor. Her dark eyes never lingered too long. She had mastered the art of disappearing inside a room full of people, and she had done it every single day for 3 years. She wasn't invisible because she was small. She was invisible because she had chosen to be. And choice, real, deliberate, surgical choice, is the most dangerous thing in the world. The penthouse dining floor smelled of aged scotch, white truffle, and the particular kind of arrogance that only old money produces. Crystal chandeliers hung low enough to feel like a warning. The kind of place where a man could ruin your life over dinner and still make his 9 o'clock tea time. Julian Vane was that kind of man. He sat at the center table like a throne had been built specifically around him, cerulean suit, jaw cut sharp enough to draw blood, and eyes that had never once considered the word no. He was 28 years old, heir to a real estate empire worth $11 billion, and he had never, not once in his entire life, been made to feel small. Cherry approached his table with practiced grace, her silver tray balanced perfectly, her expression sealed behind the quiet mask she had perfected over a decade. She set the glass down. The condensation was minimal. The placement was exact. And then the table shifted. One small drop. A single bead of water that slid from the base of Julian's crystal glass and landed on the polished toe of his Italian loafer. The temperature in the room changed before he even moved. Cherry felt it, that particular stillness before a storm that her body had learned to read years before her mind could name it. She reached for a cloth. But Julian was already rising. He grabbed a fistful of her hair. Not a tap. Not a shove. A grab, deliberate, public, designed to humiliate, and then the slap cracked through the air like a circuit breaker blowing in the dark. The silver tray hit the marble floor. The sound rang out like a death knell across the entire dining room. Conversation stopped. Forks froze mid-air. 43 people witnessed what happened, and not one of them moved. Because Julian Vane's father owned 3 of their companies, and silence in this city was a business decision. "You're a tool," Julian said, his voice low and vicious, his hand still twisted in her hair. "Tools that don't work get broken." Cherry didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She lifted her eyes, those still, obsidian eyes, and she looked at him. Not with fear. Not with shame. With something far more unsettling than either. Something that looked almost like pity. She already knew things about Julian Vane that would make a grown man weep. But this wasn't the moment. Not yet. What Julian didn't notice, what nobody in that room thought to notice, was the man at the corner window table, who had gone very, very still. He had been there for 40 minutes. Alone. A single set of chopsticks. A plate of food he had barely touched. He wore a charcoal jacket with no tie, his collar open just enough to reveal the edge of a serpent tattoo that curled up the left side of his neck. His face was composed. His hands were flat against the table. But his eyes had locked onto Cherry the moment Julian's hand moved, and they had not moved since. Leen Jun, 32 years old. Seoul born. New York arriving. The kind of man whose name made certain people in certain cities lower their voices without knowing why. He had no public profile, no social media footprint, no listed address. What he did have was a syndicate that stretched from the underground corridors of Gangnam to the financial arteries of Lower Manhattan, and a reputation so precise, so calculated, that people who worked for him referred to him only as the Ghost King. He had come to New York for one reason. And she was standing 15 feet away from him in a red uniform, holding the side of her face like she was keeping herself together by sheer force of will. 10 years. He had been searching for 10 years. Leen Jun set down his chopsticks slowly. He picked up his glass. He took one measured sip of water. And then he stood up. The air shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. Two of his men, seated at separate tables across the room, went rigid without receiving a single signal. The maitre d' near the entrance felt a chill move through him that he could not explain and would not forget. Julian Vane was still sneering. Still holding court. Still utterly convinced that the most dangerous thing in the room was himself. He had no idea that the quiet man walking toward him had spent a decade turning grief into architecture, building something patient, and permanent, and utterly without mercy. He had no idea that the girl in the red uniform had been waiting just as long. And he had absolutely no idea that the moment he touched her, he had just pulled the first thread of his own unraveling. Some people mistake silence for surrender. Cherry and Leen Jun were about to teach him the difference. Julian was still talking. That was the thing about men like him, they never noticed when the room stopped listening. He was gesturing now, explaining himself to no one in particular, straightening the lapel of his cerulean suit as though the act of smoothing fabric could smooth over what he had just done. Around him, the dining room had resumed its careful performance of normalcy. Forks clinked. Wine was poured. 43 people decided, collectively, that they had seen nothing. Leen Jun had seen everything. He walked toward Julian's table with the kind of stillness that does not belong to peaceful men. There was no urgency in his stride, no aggression telegraphed in his shoulders. He moved the way certain dangerous things move, water finding a crack in stone, slow and inevitable and utterly without mercy. The serpent tattoo on the left side of his neck caught the candlelight as he moved, the ink shifting like something alive beneath his skin. Cherry was still on the floor. Not cowering, she hadn't crumpled, hadn't dissolved. She was on one knee, gathering the pieces of the fallen tray with the focused composure of a woman who had survived far worse than this and catalogued it. Her dark hair fell forward across her jaw, shielding her expression. But her hands, those careful, deliberate hands, had gone completely still the moment she felt the change in the room's air pressure. She felt him before she saw him. Leen Jun crouched down beside her. Not standing over her. Not offering a hand down from above. He came to her level, and that alone set him apart from every other person in the room. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only she could hear it, and it carried the quiet authority of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "Leave the tray," he said. Cherry looked up. For 3 years, she had kept her eyes deliberately unfocused in rooms like this, soft gaze, no eye contact, the perfected blankness of someone who had trained themselves to be looked through rather than at. But something about the way this man had spoken made her focus sharpen without her permission. She looked at him fully. And the world did something strange. Leen Jun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise, exactly. More like recognition colliding with a 10-year-old wound. He had memorized a face from a rainy night in Seoul. A girl crouched over him in a flooded alleyway, pressing her scarf against the gash in his side, her eyes wide and terrified and absolutely, stubbornly refusing to leave him alone to die. She hadn't said a word. Not one. She had simply stayed. And then she had disappeared before dawn. He had spent a decade looking. "Don't," Cherry's eyes said, clear as language. "Don't make a scene. Don't draw attention. Don't." Leen Jun stood anyway. Julian had finally noticed the man beside his table and assembled his expression into the particular sneer reserved for interruptions. "Can I help you?" The tone was a dismissal dressed as a question. Leen Jun didn't answer immediately. He studied Julian the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, clinically, without emotion, identifying exactly where the break was. "You touched something that doesn't belong to you," Leen Jun said finally. "Quiet. Absolute." Julian laughed. "Security." And that was the moment everything fell apart, because the security that arrived didn't come for Leen Jun. They came for Julian. The head of the Vantablack security detail was a man named Cross, 6'4", former military, the kind of man whose presence alone ended conversations. Julian had hired him personally. Had doubled his salary twice. Had once watched Cross dislocate a paparazzo's shoulder in a hotel corridor and felt nothing but satisfaction. Cross walked into the dining room, took one look at Leen Jun, and dropped to one knee. The silence that followed was a different species from the silence before. This one had weight. This one pressed against the walls. Julian stared. Cross's head was bowed. His right fist was pressed flat against the marble floor in a gesture of deference so absolute, so practiced, that it was clearly not the first time he had made it. Around the room, 3 other men in dark suits, men Julian had believed were his, had gone equally still, their eyes fixed on Leen Jun with an attention that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with devotion. "What," Julian said, and his voice had lost its architecture entirely, "is this?" Cherry, still near the floor, had risen slowly to her feet. She stood slightly behind Leen Jun now, not hiding, she never hid, but watching Julian's face with an expression of quiet, surgical attention. She was reading him the way she had been reading him for 3 years. Every micro-expression. Every crack. "This," her eyes said, though no sound left her lips. "This is what I have been waiting for." Leen Jun's gaze hadn't left Julian. "The security firm you contracted," he said, his tone the same as it had been, unhurried, even, like a man describing the weather, "has been a subsidiary of my organization for 6 years. Every background check your father ran went through my office. Every clearance your family approved, I approved first." Julian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You have been protected by my infrastructure for half a decade," Leen Jun continued, "and you didn't know my name." A pause. "That ends tonight." The dining room had stopped pretending now. Guests sat frozen, drinks halfway raised, the performance of normalcy abandoned entirely. A woman near the window had her phone out beneath the table. She put it away when one of the men in dark suits glanced at her. Julian found his voice. It came out smaller than intended. "My father will." "Your father," Leen Jun said, "will do exactly what he is told. As he has always done." Something shifted in Cherry's expression then, a flicker, controlled immediately, but visible to anyone paying close enough attention. She knew something about what had just been said. Something that lived behind her ribs and had no name yet. Leen Jun turned to her then, for the first time since he had stood. He looked at her the way you look at something you have protected from a distance for so long that seeing it up close feels like trespassing on your own grief. His hand rose, slowly, deliberately, and the backs of his fingers brushed her cheekbone. The bruise forming there. Just once. Just enough. Cherry didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She simply held his gaze with those dark, still eyes, and somewhere beneath the composure she had built like a fortress around herself, something shifted. She didn't know yet what he knew. She didn't know what he carried. But her body, trained and disciplined and relentlessly controlled, betrayed her with a single, shallow breath. What he hadn't told her would change everything. The private lounge on the 43rd floor smelled of sandalwood and rain. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan below like a painting someone powerful had commissioned, all amber light and controlled darkness, the city performing its nightly theater for anyone rich enough to watch from above. Leen Jun sat at the head of a low table, jacket off now, the serpent tattoo fully visible along the left side of his neck. He hadn't asked Cherry to follow him. He hadn't needed to. She had come because the information being exchanged in this room had her name written through it like a vein of gold through stone, invisible until you knew where to cut. Across the table sat Arthur Vane. Julian's father looked nothing like his son. Where Julian was sharp-edged and loud in his cruelty, Arthur was soft-spoken and precise, a man who had learned long ago that the most effective damage is done quietly, in writing, behind closed doors. He was 61 years old. He had a foundation named after him. 3 senators owed him favors. He had ordered Cherry's father killed over a bourbon, between courses, at a dinner very much like the one downstairs. He didn't know Cherry was in the room. She stood in the shadows near the window, still in her red uniform, watching. The arrangement, Leen Jun said, setting a single folder on the table, is being renegotiated. Arthur's composure was admirable. On what grounds? On the grounds that your son put his hands on someone I have a prior claim to. Leen Jun's voice didn't change. It never changed. That was the most frightening thing about it, its complete absence of fluctuation. The Vane portfolio. The offshore accounts. The 3 shell companies registered in Seoul under names you can't pronounce. All of it was built on infrastructure my organization provided. You know this. We had an agreement. You had a lease, Leen Jun said. Leases expire. Arthur's hand moved toward his inside jacket pocket. Not for a weapon, Arthur Vane didn't carry weapons. He carried lawyers. But before his fingers found the phone, Leen Jun simply said, "Don't." And Arthur's hand stopped. Cherry watched the older man's face in the amber light, watched the exact moment a man realized that the ground beneath his empire had always belonged to someone else. It was a particular kind of collapse. Internal. Architectural. The face stayed composed while everything behind it crumbled. She had imagined this moment for 3 years. It felt different than she had expected. Not triumphant. Not satisfying. It felt like the moment before something, a coil unwinding, a breath held too long finally released. If she sheds another tear, Leen Jun said, and his voice dropped to something that was barely above silence, I unplug your heart. He didn't look at Cherry when he said it. He kept his eyes on Arthur. But the words weren't for Arthur. They were for her. Cherry's fingers tightened against the window glass behind her. A reflex. Involuntary. She released it before anyone could see. Outside, rain had begun against the glass, quiet and persistent, the way certain truths are. She pressed her back to the wall and breathed through the thing rising in her chest, the thing she had no name for and no room for, not now, not yet. Leen Jun still hadn't told her everything. She didn't know it yet, but the most devastating truth in that room wasn't Arthur Vane's. It was his. She found him an hour later on the private terrace. The rain had softened to a mist that clung to everything, to the railing, to the city lights below, to the collar of Leen Jun's shirt where he stood with his back to the door. He had a glass of water in his hand. Not scotch. Not bourbon. Water. Cherry had noticed that about him already, the deliberate absence of things other powerful men used to blur the edges of themselves. He heard her before she reached him. She knew he did, because his shoulders shifted slightly, a micro-adjustment, a man bracing for something he had no framework to prepare for. Cherry stopped 2 feet away from him and held up her phone. On the screen, she had typed 4 words. I don't want rescue. Leen Jun turned. He read the screen. Something moved through his expression, not amusement, not dismissal. Something slower and more complicated than either. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the railing between them. A burner phone, different from the one she carried. Already unlocked. A single contact saved under a symbol she recognized, a crescent, and a date 10 years old. Cherry stared at it. He knew her system. He knew she used separate devices. He had anticipated this conversation before she had it. She typed again. How long have you been watching me? Long enough, he said. He didn't elaborate. He turned back to the city, and his profile in the mist was carved and still and utterly unreadable. Long enough to know you don't need me to fight your battles. Cherry typed. Then what do you think I need? He looked at her then, fully, directly, and the answer he gave was not the one she expected. A confession, he said. The mist moved between them. Cherry went still in a way that had nothing to do with her psychological lock and everything to do with instinct, the body's warning system, going quiet before impact. The fire, Leen Jun said. The night your mother died. Cherry's jaw set. It wasn't an accident. His voice didn't waver. He had clearly rehearsed this, or had wanted to say it so many times that it had worn grooves into him. I was the reason they found the building. My operation. My mistake. I didn't know she was inside. A pause that had years in it. I have been looking for you ever since. Not to protect you. To answer for it. Cherry didn't move. The city glittered below them, indifferent and enormous. Rain beaded on the railing between their hands, centimeters apart, not touching. She looked at the screen of her phone for a long time. Long enough that Leen Jun's breathing changed, barely perceptible, barely human. Waiting. She typed slowly. I know. 3 letters. A detonation. I have known for 2 years. I needed you to say it. Leen Jun's eyes closed. Just for a second. Just long enough for something old and heavy to move through him. When he opened them, Cherry was still watching him, those obsidian eyes reading every layer of what had just passed between them, filing it away, deciding something he couldn't see yet. She picked up the burner phone he had left on the railing. She pocketed it. And then she turned and walked back inside, leaving him in the rain with the confession still burning in the air between them, and the question of what she would do with it hanging over everything like smoke. She didn't know yet that his second-in-command had already made a call. And that call was about to cost them both everything. His name was Rio. He had served Leen Jun for 7 years, through 3 cities, 2 wars, and 1 near death that Leen Jun had personally pulled him back from. He was the kind of man you trusted not because he had never given you reason to doubt him, but because you had seen him bleed for you and assumed that settled the matter. Assumptions, Cherry had learned, were how empires fell. She was in the hotel basement at midnight, the underground corridor that connected the service wing to the building's original foundation, a space the architects had never intended to be used but that Cherry had claimed 3 years ago as her own. The fluorescent light hummed. The concrete was cold. And Cherry moved through the center of the open floor with a focus that had nothing to do with the red uniform she still wore. She had been training here since her 4th week at the Vantablack. Not because she had planned to fight. But because she had understood, from the moment she walked into this hotel, that the day would come when her mind alone wouldn't be enough. She had studied every surveillance blind spot. Mapped every exit. Practiced until her body had its own memory, separate from fear. She didn't hear them come in. She felt the change in air pressure, 3 bodies entering from the north corridor, moving fast and coordinated, and she was already turning before the first man cleared the doorway. There were 3 of them. Dark clothes. No Vane insignia. That meant Leen Jun's organization. That meant the betrayal was internal. Cherry's chest tightened once. She released it. The first came at her fast, expecting a maid. He found something else entirely. She moved like water around his momentum, not blocking, redirecting, and the second man caught a structural pipe across the forearm before he had finished his approach. The third was smarter, more measured. He circled. Cherry bled from the eyebrow by the time it was over. But she was standing. All 3 were not. She pulled out the burner phone Leen Jun had left her and typed one word, basement. He arrived in 4 minutes. She had counted. Leen Jun stepped through the north corridor and stopped. He took in the scene, 3 of his men on the floor, one of them groaning, and then he looked at Cherry, standing in the center of the room with her arms loose at her sides, her dark hair half loose, blood tracing a thin line down the side of her face, her expression completely, terrifyingly calm. Something moved through him that he didn't have clean language for. Rio, Cherry typed, and held up the screen. Leen Jun's jaw hardened. She typed again, he called Julian 40 minutes before they came. I saw the call log on the third one's phone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that comes before a man recalibrates everything he thought he knew about a situation, and everyone in it. Leen Jun crossed the floor toward her. He stopped closer than necessary, and his hand rose to her jaw, tilting her face gently toward the light to examine the cut above her eye. His touch was careful, practiced in restraint. But his eyes were not calm. "You should have waited for me," he said. Cherry met his gaze without flinching. She typed, "I did. You took too long." And despite everything, the blood, the bodies, the betrayal coiled like smoke through the room, the corner of Leen Jun's mouth moved. What he did next would change everything between them. The Vantablack Hotel had a secret that predated the Vane family's ownership by 11 years. Cherry had known about it since she was 14 years old, sitting on the floor of her father's study while he showed her, quietly and with great care, the thing he had built to protect her future. A digital vault, not in any cloud, not on any server that could be seized or subpoenaed. Embedded in the hotel's original foundation architecture. Sealed with a single mechanism that no amount of money, threat, or corporate maneuvering could replicate. Her voice. Her unaltered, uncoerced, willing voice. The Vanes had understood this within 6 months of acquiring the hotel. They had tried lawyers first. Then fabricated documents. Then, with increasing desperation over 3 years, they had tried to make Cherry speak, creating environments of fear and humiliation designed to provoke a scream, a sob, a single involuntary word captured on audio. Julian's cruelty hadn't been random. It had been a strategy. Leen Jun sat across from her in his private suite as she laid this out on the phone screen, line by line, and watched his expression move through comprehension into something cold and surgical. "They never intended to break you emotionally," he said. Cherry shook her head. "They needed my voice. Just once. And the vault contains everything." She paused. "Deed. Offshore accounts. Evidence of the murder contract on my father. Names. Dates. Wire transfers." Another pause. Enough to end them permanently. Leen Jun was quiet for a long moment, thought moving too fast for expression. Then he slid a folder across the table. Cherry opened it. It was a transcript, a recorded conversation between Julian and a man whose name she recognized as a senior federal prosecutor. A dinner, 3 weeks ago, at a restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel. The prosecutor had been offered a number with 7 digits. The case files Cherry's father had filed before his death, the ones the police had claimed were lost, were being suppressed. Julian had been buying his own exoneration while she served him water. Cherry set the folder down. Her hands were steady. She had learned to keep them steady when the thing inside her chest went white hot with rage, because rage was a fuel and fuel needed to be conserved, not spent. She looked at Leen Jun. "How long have you had this?" 3 weeks. "Why didn't you?" "Because," he said, and his voice carried something unfamiliar, something almost careful, "I needed you to be ready. Not just legally. I needed you to be the one who chose when." Cherry stared at him. Nobody had ever given her that before. Not readiness as a gift. Not the decision as something that belonged to her. Every person who had ever claimed to protect her had done it by taking the choice from her hands. She looked at the vault access panel on her phone, the one she had never activated. She looked at him. And then she typed the word that was not a question and not a request. It was a declaration. Tonight. What happened next at the peace dinner would end a dynasty. The ballroom of the Vantablack Hotel had been built for the performance of power. 40-foot ceilings. Burgundy drapes that pooled on marble like spilled wine. Gold accents on every surface that caught light and threw it back doubled, tripled, amplified, because old money understood that the appearance of wealth was itself a form of intimidation. Tonight, the charity gala had filled every table with New York's most carefully curated elite, politicians, developers, press, the kind of philanthropists who donated to causes with one hand and funded the conditions that created them with the other. Cherry stood at the service entrance in her red uniform for the last time. She had activated the vault 40 minutes ago. Standing alone in the basement corridor, in front of the access panel her father had shown her when she was a child, she had opened her mouth, and she had spoken her name. Her full name. Slowly, clearly, with a steadiness that surprised even her, given the decade of silence it had broken. The vault had opened. Everything her father had built for her was now in motion, uploading, distributing, filing. She walked into the ballroom. Julian saw her immediately. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of animal instinct that preceded understanding. He looked wrong tonight. Unraveled at the edges. The bribing of Rio had failed. His father had stopped returning his calls. And the prosecutor he had paid had gone suddenly, inexplicably unreachable. Julian understood, on some level, that the walls were moving. He did what cornered men do. He reached for the last thing he could still control. The gun appeared from inside his jacket in a movement that the room's security missed by seconds, a small, elegant weapon, the kind that didn't announce itself. He closed the distance to Cherry in 4 strides and positioned himself behind her, his arm across her collarbones, the barrel at her temple. The room detonated into screaming. Cherry went still. Not frozen, still. There is a difference. Frozen is fear locking the body. Still is the mind taking over completely, cataloging, calculating, deciding. Cherry's dark eyes swept the room with a composure so absolute that several people near the front would later tell investigators she looked like she had expected this. She had. She's a maid, Julian's voice rang out across the silenced ballroom, cracked through the middle with desperation. She is nobody. And nobody is going to take anything from me. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Leen Jun walked in. He walked through a room full of drawn weapons, his men had materialized at every exit, silent as a tide coming in, and he did not hurry. His serpent tattoo was visible above his open collar. His hands were loose at his sides. He looked at Julian the way a man looks at something that has already ended and simply hasn't been told yet. She isn't a maid, Leen Jun said, his voice filling the ballroom with quiet, absolute authority. She is the owner of this building. The queen of my heart. And the woman who is about to end your lineage. Cherry felt the barrel waver. She moved. One precise, practiced motion, the same motion she had rehearsed in a cold basement for 3 years, and the gun was no longer at her temple. Julian stumbled. The screens above the gala stage flickered, then filled with documents, wire transfers, photographs, recordings. Cherry stood in the center of the ballroom floor, chest rising and falling, her dark hair loose around her face, her uniform the last remnant of the disguise she would never wear again. She looked at Julian. And she spoke. Checkmate. Julian Vane was escorted out of his own gala by men who did not belong to any police department. The authorities arrived 17 minutes later to a scene that had already been arranged, evidence packaged, witnesses settled, every loose thread tied with the precision of someone who had been planning this night for 3 years and had the assistance of someone who had been planning it for 10. The federal prosecutor who had accepted Julian's payment was on a recorded line within the hour. Arthur Vane, watching the screens replay his own voice ordering the murder of Cherry's father, did not resist when the handcuffs came. The Vantablack Hotel belonged to Cherry. The deed confirmed it. Cherry stood on the helipad of the 47th floor as the sun began to split the Manhattan skyline open, amber and rose bleeding into the dark, the city below still loud and indifferent and entirely, completely changed. She had changed her clothes. The red uniform was gone. She wore black silk now, something that had been laid in her room without explanation, fitted and quiet and nothing like the disguise she had lived in for 3 years. She stood at the railing with her arms loose, her dark skin warm in the early light, her eyes on the horizon with an expression that was not triumph and was not relief. It was something older than both. Something earned. She heard him before she saw him. Leen Jun came through the rooftop door and stopped a few feet behind her. He didn't speak immediately. He had a habit of that, of giving silence the space to say what words would compress. She had learned this about him. She was still learning what to do with it. "It's done," he said. She nodded once. He came to stand beside her at the railing. Close enough that she was aware of the exact distance between them, the warmth of him in the cold morning air, the steadiness of his breathing against the wind. The serpent tattoo caught the first light. He set something on the railing between them. A tray. Small, silver, like the ones she had carried for 3 years. But this one held nothing utilitarian. It held 2 rings, simple and exact, resting against the metal with a gravity that made the ordinary object feel like an altar. Cherry looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked at him. His expression was unguarded in a way she had only glimpsed before, all the architecture of control that made him the Ghost King set aside, just briefly, just here, leaving something underneath that was simply a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and was asking, without asking, if he could finally set it down. Cherry picked up one of the rings. She turned it in her fingers. Then she set it back on the tray. She picked up her phone. Typed slowly. Held up the screen. "Ask me properly." Leen Jun looked at the screen. Something moved through his face, that rare, devastating thing that was almost a smile, and he turned to face her fully, the rising sun behind him, the city spread below them like a kingdom waiting for its owners to arrive. He didn't kneel. He didn't perform. He simply looked at her, the woman who had outmaneuvered an empire, who had saved him in a Seoul alleyway and again in a Manhattan basement, who had carried 10 years of silence like a sword, and he said her name. Just her name. And Cherry, who had not cried in a decade, felt something crack quietly open behind her eyes. She breathed through it. Set her jaw. Looked at him with those obsidian eyes, steady, and ruthless, and completely, finally, her own. And she typed her answer. Yes. The sun rose over Manhattan. The Ghost King and his queen stood on the roof of everything they had reclaimed, and the city below had no idea what it was looking at, 2 people who had chosen each other through grief and deception and fire, who had built something in the ruins of everything that tried to break them, who would run these shadows together now with the kind of quiet, absolute authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Some thrones are taken by force. Theirs had been earned in silence. And that is where their story begins. If this journey had you locked in from the very first word, hit subscribe right now so you never miss when the next story drops. Drop your city in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And tell me honestly, are you Team Cherry or Team Leen Jun? Let the debate begin. See you in the next one.